They say the blood of a family runs deeper than the rivers that carve through the land, but when that blood begins to turn inward, when it circles back upon itself, something begins to wither. Something ancient, fragile, and horrifying takes root. Tonight, you will walk into the silence of a family line so entangled in itself that daughters were never daughters, uncles were never just uncles, and the word family lost all meaning. A lineage where a sister could be passed from uncle to nephew, as if she were nothing more than a worn heirloom, used, bound, and locked inside the prison of her own blood. This is not myth nor legend. It is not some dark fairy tale whispered to scare children into obedience. This is real. It happened here on American soil, and its shadows remain. In the most hidden corners of this country, you will find names that no one dares speak aloud, homes that stand like crooked tombstones of a living curse, and family trees that coil like snakes devouring their own tails. The bloodline we are about to uncover is not only one of the most inbred to ever exist, it is also one of the most concealed. Their shame became their survival. The silence was their shield, and yet, generation after generation, the truth leaked through in the faces of the children, foreheads too broad, eyes set just off-center, jaws twisted by heredity that refused to let go. The land itself seemed to recoil, as though it knew what had been planted there. As you listen, remember this. You are hearing what most were never meant to hear. You are entering a story buried under layers of dirt, secrecy, and denial. What was done inside these homes stayed there, but the evidence was always written in bone, in blood, in the very shape of those who carried the curse forward. And now, we open the pages of this forbidden chapter of America's past, peeling them back one by one until the whole era stands bare. What does it mean for a sister to be handed over from uncle to nephew? What does it mean for generations to fold upon themselves until identity and kinship dissolve into something unrecognizable? Tonight you'll see the answer, and it may stay with you longer than you wish. The story begins in the hills, isolated, forgotten, and far from the watchful eyes of the towns that lined the main roads. These families lived in places where silence was thicker than air, where the land itself seemed to guard them from intrusion. Poverty was the soil in which this bloodline grew, but secrecy was the water that kept it alive. Outsiders rarely came, and when they did, they never stayed long enough to ask questions. The windows were covered, the doors stayed shut, and the only voices that filled the rooms belonged to people who all shared the same last name. Here, the meaning of kinship eroded. A sister was never just a sister. She was currency. She was property. Passed along in silence, handed down like a thing, her existence measured only by the demands of men bound to the same family tree. An uncle might claim her, only for the next generation to inherit her, as though she were a parcel of land. The cycle was not broken by time. It deepened with each passing year. The children who emerged from these arrangements bore the marks. Some carried them in their faces, features stretched or collapsed by repetition of the same blood. Others carried them in their minds, speech slowed, thought clouded, innocence stripped before it had the chance to bloom. They became living testaments to the curse of a family turned inward, unable or unwilling to let the outside world in. But the greatest horror was not in the deformities or the stares of those who knew the truth. The horror was in the silence. No one dared speak of it, not even those trapped within it. Mothers raised their children to accept what would come. Daughters grew up knowing their place was not to choose, but to be chosen. And the men, fathers, uncles, nephews, saw nothing unnatural in continuing what had always been done. It was their way of keeping the family pure, though purity was the last word, and Ted, an outside, would have used to describe what was festering behind those doors. Generations began to blur into each other. Fathers became uncles, nephews became husbands, and sisters became mothers many times over, to children who bore no distinction between relation and violation. The bloodline knotted itself tighter with each passing decade until escape seemed impossible. This was not just a family. It was a system, a cage built out of tradition, shame, and fear, and those who lived inside it carried the curse forward, whether they wanted to or not. As the years dragged on, the bloodline began to wear its history openly upon the faces of its children. In the towns nearby, whispers spread like a chill through the air. Strangers would lower their voices when the name was spoken, if it was spoken at all. For many, it was safer to pretend the family didn't exist. But the truth could not be hidden in the children who wandered down dirt roads or stared blankly from porch steps, their very appearance a silent confession of what had been done to them. The signs were undeniable: sunken cheeks, foreheads stretched unnaturally high, eyes misaligned as though the body itself could no longer remember how to form symmetry. Speech faltered, thoughts stumbled, and lives seemed trapped in a haze of repetition. These were not just quirks of nature. They were the fingerprints of blood folding upon itself too many times. Every feature, every slurred word, was a record of sins passed down like inheritance. But what truly unnerved the outsiders was not the way the children looked. It was the way they were kept. Rarely seen, rarely spoken to, they were hidden behind walls of decaying wood, shielded not out of love, but out of shame. And yet, inside those walls, the cycle continued. The girls reached womanhood and became part of the same exchange their mothers and grandmothers had endured. The boys became men, and men became predators, not strangers, but kin. Every generation was promised to the next. An uncle would take what he wanted, only for a nephew to inherit the same claim. And still, the silence held. No one reported it, no one intervened. The town looked away, the state ignored what it suspected, and the family carried on as though this was life, as though there was no other way it could be. It is here, in this suffocating silence, that the most disturbing truth emerges. The victims were taught not to see themselves as victims. To them it was tradition, a grim inheritance carved into their flesh and bones. There was no rebellion, no escape, only the quiet march forward into another generation of twisted faces and broken minds. And so the line endured, not in spite of its secrecy, but because of it. The shame that should have ended it instead became the chain that bound it. Each child born carried not only the blood of their parents, but the burden of a past no one dared to speak aloud. But history has a way of bleeding through the cracks, no matter how tightly it is sealed. Eventually, outsiders began to take notice. A traveling preacher, a wandering journalist, a passing doctor, each saw glimpses of the truth, each recoiled at what they found. They spoke of it in hushed tones, careful not to name names, careful not to put words to what they had seen. Because to put it into words was to admit that such a thing could happen here, in a country that prided itself on progress, on decency, on civilization. Yet the records exist, hidden in fragments. Birth certificates that list fathers old enough to be grandfathers, marriages that bind children to their uncles, documents where the same last name repeats again and again until the tree resembles not a branching network, but a noose tightening around itself. There are testimonies too, half-forgotten stories whispered by neighbors who dared to glance too closely, who claimed to have seen young girls carried from one home to another under cover of night. They knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to be the one to break the silence. And so the family endured, generation after generation, watched but untouched. To intervene would have meant confronting not just this one bloodline, but the reality of how many others like it might exist, tucked away in the hollows and valleys of a land that still carried the weight of its isolation. But the curse was more than genetic. It was spiritual. To grow up in that house meant to inherit not just the shape of the face or the slowness of the tongue, but the acceptance of what was to come. Girls were raised with the knowledge of their future. Boys were raised to believe their claim was a birthright. This was not a family that chose its path. It was a family that believed it had no path left to choose. And still, the outside world refused to name it. Newspapers would print stories of strange families, of isolated people with unusual traits, but they would never reveal the whole. because to reveal the whole would be to look directly into the abyss of what blood can do when left to coil endlessly in on itself. Even now, if you drive far enough down those roads, if you find the houses half-rotted and leaning into the earth, you might feel it, the heaviness in the air, the quiet that is not peace, but burial. The curse lingers there, not just in the ruins, but in the descendants who still walk the land. There is a moment, somewhere in the middle of the bloodline, where the story becomes less about survival and more about inevitability. By then, the children knew nothing else. Their world was so small that the family became the entire universe. To them, it was not strange that a sister could belong first to an uncle, then to a nephew. It was not shocking that mothers and daughters shared the same fate. When there is no outside, there is no comparison. And when there is no comparison, horror becomes ordinary. This is where the tragedy sharpens, because for many of these children, the suffering was not loud, it was quiet. They laughed, they played in the dirt, they chased one another through broken barns and across fields where no other children came. They carried joy in the only way they knew how. But the shadow was always there. They were growing toward a destiny they did not choose, a future already written in the silence of their mother's eyes. Some who encountered them spoke of the uncanny sense of being in their presence. Their gaze did not meet yours the way most children's do. Their smiles lingered a beat too long. Their laughter bent strangely at the edges. It was as if they were both there and not there, caught between innocence and the weight of something too dark to name. Outsiders often turned away quickly, unsettled not only by what they saw, but by what they felt, a creeping recognition that this was not how a family should look, not how children should grow. And yet, the cycle deepened. Nephews became men and claimed the women their uncles had once taken. Daughters bore children who would one day stand in the same roles, their lives less like stories unfolding and more like patterns repeating. Each generation was less a continuation than a mirror, reflecting the same twisted image, slightly more blurred each time. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because most turn away, most cannot stomach the truth when it stares back at them through the hollow eyes of a forgotten child. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run from it, or would the silence pull you in, just as it pulled them? In that silence, the most chilling realization begins to form, that what was passed down was not just blood, but destiny, and destiny in this house was inescapable. By the time the 20th century turned, the bloodline had become a legend in whispers. Neighbors knew but never intervened. Officials suspected but never investigated. Teachers looked at the children in their classrooms and quietly lowered their expectations. It was easier to pity than to act, easier to turn a blind eye than to step into a darkness that had been festering for generations. But the curse did not just stay in the faces or in the bodies, it lived in the way these children carried themselves. The men grew into adulthood with a strange sense of entitlement, their voices echoing with the authority of fathers and uncles who had taught them that a woman was never her own. The women grew into silence, trained from birth to accept, to endure, to survive without protest. Together, they became both the prisoners and the guards of their own family's prison. And still, the family tree twisted tighter. It no longer resembled a tree at all, but a circle, a closed loop where every path led back to the same names, the same blood, the same curse. A sister was not seen as a sister, but as a vessel for continuation. An uncle's role was not seen as wrong, but as rightful. A nephew's inheritance was not land or wealth or freedom, but the woman his uncle had once claimed. What makes this story so chilling is not just the deformities, not just the poverty, not just the isolation. It is the realization that this cycle continued for so long because no one dared to name it for what it was. Shame thrives in silence, and silence gave this bloodline room to grow. If someone had spoken, if someone had stepped forward, perhaps the chain could have been broken. But no one did. And so the family lived, generation after generation, bound together in a ritual no one outside would ever call sacred. Even now, the echoes remain. You can find them in old photographs, faces staring out from the past with unsettling stillness, their expressions almost human, but not quite. You can find them in birth records that seem to repeat themselves, looping endlessly as though time itself was trapped inside that family's name. And if you go deep enough into the valleys where they once lived, you can still feel it, the weight of a silence that does not rest, the kind that follows you even after you've left. This was never just a story about one family. It is a warning about what happens when blood is treated like a cage, when tradition becomes a weapon, and when silence allows horror to pass itself down as though it were heritage. And so we arrive at the final truth, the one that lingers long after the story has ended. What began as secrecy became tradition, what began as survival became inheritance, and what began as family became something that no longer deserved the name. A sister passed from uncle to nephew, a daughter raised to bear children who would one day face the same fate, a son taught that blood gave him ownership, not kinship. This was the rhythm of their lives, the heartbeat of a curse disguised as a bloodline. The tragedy is not only in what was done, it is in how it was remembered. For the world outside, these people became monsters, curiosities, the most inbred family alive. But behind the deformities, behind the silence, they were still human beings, trapped inside a cycle too ancient, too suffocating to escape. The horror is not that monsters existed. It is that ordinary men and women, bound by poverty, isolation, and silence, created something monstrous out of themselves. Think of what it means for generations to fold in on each other until there is no longer a beginning or an end. Think of what it means to be born into a name that carries not pride, not honor, but shame. The children of this line never had a choice. They inherited not only their parents' blood, but the weight of decisions made long before they were born. To look into their faces is to look into the echo of sins repeated so many times that they became the only truth left, and still the silence endures. The old homes may be collapsing, the land may be overgrown, but the story remains. It remains in archives rarely opened, in photographs few dare to look at twice, in the whispers of neighbors who still remember what once lived just beyond their roads. The bloodline may wither, but its lesson does not. Because this story is not just about them, it is about us, about how communities choose silence over confrontation, how shame is buried until it grows roots, and how the darkest truths are often the ones we refuse to name. And when we do not name them, they do not die. They endure, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to look into the past and see not just what happened, but what was allowed to happen. You have walked through that silence tonight. You have seen what was not meant to be seen, and now the question is yours to carry. If this was your bloodline, would you be strong enough to break the chain? Or would you too be swallowed by the silence?